Today on Conversations Aloud, we're discussing whether the West is really facing a civilizational collapse, or at least a decline. Or is this just rhetoric designed to scare us? We're joined by Dr. John Rapley, a journalist and macroanalyst focusing on geopolitics, global political economy, and policy studies. He's also the author of several books, including Why Empires Fall, Rome, America, and the Future of the West. Welcome to the show, Dr. John.
Nice to be with you, Adi.
Great to have you on. So we'll just kind of go straight into it. Is the West truly facing civilizational collapse or decline? And if so, in what sense? Is it economic, cultural, political?
Yeah. So this is really two questions in one you've asked there, Hadi. Is it civilizational collapse or is it decline? And it is decline. It's not collapse. I don't see collapse happening. My book, Why Empires Fall, which I wrote with my co-author, Peter Heather, we compared the late Roman Empire to the contemporary world. And we found an awful lot of similarities, but the big difference is that in antiquity, because the economy was essentially a steady state economy, the rise of one meant the decline of another, but necessarily, and that's no longer the case today, that the rise of the global periphery, or what was the global periphery, the former colonial empires, it entails the relative decline of the West. It doesn't entail the absolute decline. Now, having said that, that's not to say that countries, individual countries, and quite possibly quite a few Western countries will move from relative to absolute decline. And by absolute decline, I would say, we're looking at a decline in per capita GDP. I mean, a couple of countries have already done that. And I think the United States is now at risk of that. But that is a function of their internal policy choices. That's a choice of, it really comes down to how do they engage with this fact of relative decline? Do they, as it were, embrace it? Do they work with it? Do they try and forge partnerships with the rising powers of the developing world and create a new world order, which would be, frankly, a fairer world order? Or do they try and fight it? Do they try and resist it to try and make America great again, or to restore Britain to its former glory, or whatever it is they want to do? And we're seeing, at the end of our book, we do say that if they try to go that MAGA route, if they try to restore their greatness, they will actually paradoxically end up accelerating the process relative to absolute decline, and we'll actually begin to see falling living standards. Whether that brings about societal collapse it becomes a possibility amid absolute decline, because then it becomes a fight over a diminishing pie and who gets what, and that can become very ugly. And we're seeing that in the politics of Western societies. We're seeing, in the first instance, it's manifesting itself in anti-immigrant behavior, which is actually one of the risks of accelerating economic decline, because you have falling populations, declining labor force. They simply can't support the social systems they've built unless they bring in immigrants. If they begin to resist immigration, they will actually accelerate their own decline. At which point, I think then the fight becomes much more vicious internal. I think we're starting to see early signs of this, possibly in the US, this really a turn towards a very ugly, divisive politics. Whether or not that's a permanent or a temporary feature, that remains to be seen. I mean, there are many who hope that, in fact, this will, the very problems that are going to be occasioned by this politics, not least the economic problems, are going to cause a turn against it. But it could, of course, cause an acceleration into it. It's too early to say.
Yeah, and to your point, it's really interesting seeing the U.S. reaction to this change in the balancing power of the world. It's kind of got into, you said you've got two options. Do you partner with the global South, or do you bully them into submission, into what you want, and creating kind of win-lose situations instead of win-win situations, which seems to be what Trump has chosen to do. And the funny part of it is it's pushing the global South to kind of focus more on the BRICS and accelerate that process of being less dependent on the West, especially the US and the demise of possibly the US dollar. But going back to that point about the social aspect of it, because you hear, some commentators using dramatic language, like, millions of invaders landing on our shores, conquering our towns. And you hear the great replacement, which is, of course, we've got the issue with birth rates happening. Is there substance to this statement, or is there a conspiracy to replace the white population of the West?
If there is, I haven't been able to find who's
You're not
behind
part
it.
of that
I mean,
conspiracy.
no, no, I have to. Well, if I were, of course, I wouldn't confess it, right? So, no, look, I mean, the great replacement theory, which is something I've written about elsewhere, it really goes back to um, a novel that was written in the early 1970s and ran, basically sort of far right nationalists ran with this. And there is a difficulty in particularly European societies, which most European countries don't have a history of immigration. I mean, I can remember about 10 years ago interviewing a man who was then the mayor of Athens in Greece. And he made the point, he said, until the turn of the millennium, Greece had only ever exported workers. It had never had the experience of importing workers. And it now found itself completely overwhelmed because it simply didn't know how to deal with it. I mean, unlike Canada, unlike the US, unlike Australia, unlike South Africa for that matter, which are countries with long histories of immigration, and unlike, some countries in other parts of the world, which have long histories of accommodating immigrants and finding ways, to sort of hybridize the society rather effectively and maintain a civil society. European countries, by and large, with some exceptions, but by and large, they have this sort of connection between nationhood and ethnic identity, which has always just been beneath the surface and sometimes is well above the surface. And so this is we're beginning to see a resurgence of this. But what I have argued elsewhere is that, I mean, there has been a replacement of sorts, but the replacement wasn't done through the importation of immigrants. It was done by the export of capital. It was done by outsourcing production. So you replace workers in Philadelphia who've become too expensive by outsourcing the plant to Southeast Asia or to East Asia. And what this does is it boosts share values. It boosts returns to the shareholders in Western companies, which benefits its owners. And those owners, in no small measure, are in fact the very pension funds that are supporting the growing retired population, because the returns on capital aren't sufficient, and by and large, to be able to do that using homegrown economic activities. So outsourcing became a way, but it did mean that there was a replacement of the working class in Western countries by the working class of the developing world, all of which would be a natural process and a healthy process. Had it been handled differently by Western governments, had they said, well, these firms are making bigger profits, so we're going to tax them more on these profits and we're going to redistribute those so we can create new opportunities for displaced workers. They didn't. They went in for a neoliberal strategy, which basically meant that owners claimed all the benefits, that worsened inequality, and that created this sort of very socially fragile situation we have in Western countries today. As they say, in the short term, the politics is manifesting itself in a turn on immigrants. This won't work. Economically, it will fail. And that's when politics will get really ugly as people start turning on each other. We may be seeing early hints of that in the US, but I mean, I think we've seen it in other European countries where there is a sort of us and them division, which reflects opportunistic leadership, who are, seeing opportunities for their own advancement and exploiting those divisions, and ineffective leadership, sort of building a case for a national vision that is more inclusive. And I think the issue of immigration needs to be tackled head on, because I think there hasn't been a very effective. Nobody is right now making the case for immigration, but what the polls in quite a few of these countries reveal time and again is that the public still remains open to immigration. There is a concern about unmanaged immigration. There is also a concern about unskilled immigration, that they would like the idea of skilled workers coming in. If it is a question of bringing in people to keep the fast food prices lower, that becomes a different matter. So I think what is needed is leadership that will actually make, say, look, part of our renewal as a society, part of our sustainability as a society is going to depend on the labor force. We're not growing it fast enough. We're going to need help, and this is going to be good for everybody. But instead, everybody is sort of trying to avoid that and just trying to outbid each other in the stakes to, who's more hostile to foreigners than the other, which I think is leading Western countries down. It's a downward spiral.
Yeah, and do you feel that the issue is there's a big different, the establishment, it seems the establishment politicians, their views about immigration really doesn't match up with what the public thinks about immigration. I was looking at an FT article today, actually, where it showed the public and politicians are aligned on, capitalism versus socialism, redistribution to the most part. But when it comes to immigration, and the other part was tougher sentencing. There's a big gap there between what the public thinks and views in terms of their, views versus the politicians. And that gap is being leveraged by certain individuals because they can gain so much share of the vote by touching just on those things, because we're seeing the establishment not being able to take action on those points. And that's creating that gap where, Trump and other political parties are, like Nigel Farage over here, taking really advantage of that.
Absolutely. No, I think there has been there, and this goes back really a generation. This goes back to the 1990s. I think there has been a growing cleavage between what we can call the political establishment, the main parties, the main leaders, government, and the people they represent. And we're seeing that become really quite acute. We've seen that become acute in many Western countries over the last couple of years on a couple of issues. One, I would say, is the sort of the neoliberal sort of compact was this kind of strange combination of economic conservatism and social liberalism. When in fact, what the displaced working class of the 1990s of the era of neoliberal globalization really wanted was the reverse. Social conservatism but economic liberalism. I think questions of identity are coming to the fore, and if you listen to, for example, the Democratic Party or the Labour Party or the Conservative Party in Britain, I mean, they sort of think working class responds primarily to material incentives. And so you promise them better healthcare, or you promise them better labor contracts, and they will put up with just about anything else. But one of the things that I think is emerging and has emerged in, the Brexit vote in Britain with some of the support for Donald Trump in America, there is a question of identity, particularly at the level of the community. There's been a real sense among many, many people, especially in smaller towns and smaller cities, that their communities are collapsing. Public services are much poorer. The lights, the streets look dirty. The lights don't always work.
They've been left behind.
They feel very much left behind. And I think part of this has to do with communities. When I say changing, it's not just an influx of foreigners. It's more importantly the exodus of their own children, say, well, there's no opportunities in this town, so I'm going to London or I'm going to Berlin or wherever I can find work. And a feeling of loss there. And I don't think that has been given sufficient attention. So that it then becomes a convenient for a xenophobic politician who wants to try and exploit this. It becomes an opportunity to say, well, the real problem is you have all these foreigners coming in and changing the complexion of the city, and it's not the town or your neighborhood, and you don't recognize it anymore. And I don't know if that's a problem, because, these towns were, having their complexion changed for generations, and there wasn't necessarily the kind of tension we're seeing today, because they were doing so at a time of economic growth, of dynamism, where things were getting better. I think it's because of this idea that the pie is diminishing. Those at the top are able to defend their share, which means that everybody else is paying the price. And there's a sense of loss, which is then compounded by what you look around you. So even though on paper, in the aggregate figures, you look at, you say, well, these economies are still in, relatively robust shape. What's the problem? In the way people perceive it in their daily lives, there is a sense of real decay there. And I think that really comes to, it's a distributional issue. That what, we argued in our book, Why Empires Fall, is part of the difficulty Western countries are encountering is that the post-war period, what we call the height of the imperial age, the Western imperial age, saw annual economic growth rates in the 4 to 6% range, which meant that governments were able to make all sorts of extremely generous promises for the future, including, for example, retirement went from spending a few years not being plunged into indigence because we create a pension that will keep you, able to live a minimal standard for the remaining days you have, which might have only been 10 years, to being a period you have in France is dealing with this problem acutely right now. People spend more time retired than they did working, and they actually earn more when collecting a pension than they did when they were working. I mean, it's a completely unsustainable system, but the promises were made because there was this expectation that growth would continue to make it possible to support this.
Yeah. I mean,
When I say that,
just on that, I mean, the NHS, the National Health Service over here, was built during that period. The benefit system was built during that period. The promises of the pensions were, as you said, given in that period, and they just didn't expect people to be living this long with the medicine that we have and the technologies that we have.
and so what the solution of governments has been when faced with this, you're not generating enough resources. That growth rate is not 4 to 6%. It's more like 1 to 2% at best. And so the budgetary forecasts we made don't apply. What do? Well, you basically squeeze more and more money from the working population. There are a number of ways you do this. You can do it straight through the tax system. In Britain is the triple lock on pensions, which means that share of national income every year goes up that has to be allocated to pensions, which means that workers necessarily face what they face. In fact, in Britain is effectively higher tax rates. They haven't changed the tax rate, but using fiscal drift and then using also incorporating student loans, which the previous generation who are now collecting their pensions didn't have to take on student loan. The younger generation do. It gets factored into their taxes. So effectively their tax rate is much higher. So you're taxing the working population to support, to keep these promises up. And somebody has to muster the courage to say, well, we can't do this. Or if we are going to do it, we're going to have to completely transform the society. We're going to have to not restrict immigration, but double it. We're going to have to cut a number of services. We're going to have to raise taxes across the board. Nobody wants to come out. There's been a real lack of leadership in both parties. The Conservatives go on and on about how they're going to cut taxes. Reform makes magical promises about how they're going to both cut taxes and increase spending. And Labour claims to be the adult in the room, but it says it's going to restore public service by restoring growth, but it doesn't have a coherent strategy for doing that. It's just basically, again, being forced to squeeze more and more money out of a smaller and smaller share of the population in order not to touch the beneficiaries at the top. And I think it's become an unsustainable situation.
Yeah, I want to touch on taxes, but before I do that, you mentioned their identities as a big issue, especially with immigration. Because, some people will argue, it doesn't matter, race doesn't really matter. What matters is culture. What is a country? It's the people that create it. You need a common culture to create unity and cohesion. And if you have mass migration of people with different cultures to the host nation, then trust goes down and conflict arises. Is kind of this cultural fragmentation a driver of decline?
I wouldn't say it's a driver of decline. I think, well, I mean, it may contribute to that sense of decay that you get. I mean, the fundamental decline is an economic decline. It is driven by, the fact that the West grew. I mean, part of the reason it had such an extraordinary growth rate, it was benefiting from being at the top of an imperial system that was steering more of the planet's resources to it. Even though it accounted for less than a fifth of the world's population, by the end of the 20th century, it accounted for 4/5 of its consumption. It was an extraordinary time, but it was never going to last. And politicians are determined that they will somehow restore that position of dominance, and they continue to dominate that way. And they simply won't. The Western share of global economic output is going to continue to decline. And rather than, as I say, confront that, they search for scapegoats. I think immigration is something, we have to be honest about it. I mean, it's a challenge when you're bringing in people who come from, I grew up in Canada. And Canada, when I was a child, Canada's always been an immigrant culture. And there's always been tensions between immigrants and the native population. And they always have found ways to work around it. Now, when I was a child, it was, I grew up in because I grew up in a French Canadian community. You had a lot fewer immigrants, but I also, come from an English speaking family. And so those immigrants are coming mostly from European countries, and they might not have been native English speakers, but they learned to speak English. And there always was some tension. But today, the real change is, I mean, fundamentally, you would say, but most of them were coming from Christian cultures, for example. Even if they weren't religious, they kind of were rooted in that particular cultural tradition. So therefore, everybody celebrated the same festivals. There was a kind of, you said Merry Christmas and all the rest of it. Today in Canada, you come here and you see there's a much more of a population coming from, first of all, non-European countries, and then secondly, not from Christian countries. Now, I would say Canada's done a fairly good job of working around this. Part of the way it has done this is Canada long had a tradition that, in a sense, there wasn't the same sort of attachment to public festivals. Everybody sort of, the view was kind of, well, you keep religion in your home. You don't really tell your friends about it. And you keep to yourselves in that respect. And in the public square, we would have fairly anodyne, inoffensive celebrations. And that sometimes creates a complaint among people who visit Canada. They'll say, well, it's kind of boring. There's nothing, there just isn't the same drama around, sporting events or other things. There isn't the same sense of passion. But on the other hand, what there is a high degree of tolerance. It's sort of a typical sight in Canada that I never see, I never recall seeing in London or France or Germany. Very common sight is you see, two teenage girls, one will be in a mini skirt and a halter top and the other one in a full hijab. But these are best friends walking to school and back. And it's done without any particular kind of sense of self-consciousness. So there are ways to manage immigration. I think the difficulty is that if you think of the public festivals, again, you come back, well, what is a Canadian? And it's very difficult because it's such a malleable identity to say. Whereas if you say, well, what does it mean to be English? An awful lot of people have a very strong preconception of what it means. It isn't necessarily that they say it has to be white, but all the things that they associate with Englishness, they associate with whiteness. England has, however, and London is probably an example of this as a city. And I often say to people, they say, do you like living in England? And I say, well, I like living in London. I'm not, I'm half English, but I'm not as big a fan of England as I am of London. And they never quite understand this until they've experienced. But London, like New York, is almost like a country in its own right.
It's a different country.
It's a different country. But I would say it's done integration fairly well. I mean, there are tensions. There are always going to be tensions. There are tensions in every community. There isn't a place on the planet where you don't have these kinds of tensions. But I would say by and large, London has done a remarkable job managing them. And it's not the only British city that has done that. So, I mean, there is a path forward. I think what there needs to be on the part of the cultural, intellectual, and political elites and the corporate elites in Western countries, which are very urban, which are very London-centric, Manchester-centric, I think there has to be a greater sensitivity to that tradition, that even if it's not yours, even if Morris dancing isn't something, when I lived in Oxford for a number of years, even though Morris dancing isn't something I have any interest in, to kind of say, well, it is the local county tradition, uphold it, even just because there is a sense of continuity there. And you get sometimes an intolerance toward it. Well, these are just old, silly traditions and, the quicker they go, the better. So, on the one hand, I personally, as I say, I celebrate that diversity of London. I lived for a long time in Brixton, which is a community I love, which is very much at the epicenter of not just Black Britain, but multicultural Britain. But I also, do my bit to buy local beer and, and try and keep certain traditions alive and support the local football club. And I think these things do matter. And I think there has to be greater sensitivity, but there is a way forward. And we know what it is. And I think that needs to be embraced and celebrated more loudly, I think, by those political leaders who are trying to fight this nativist sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in terms of especially London. It's great when you go out in London. It's like you're going out and meeting everyone from around the world. That you find out about what's happening in Venezuela and what's happening in Russia because it's just a pot of people, which makes the food amazing too. But what I feel like is the problem is that at one point, at one angle, there is net migration of 700,000 people a year. That's a net migration. That's a very, very large number. And even if you think immigration is great, which I do think is great, it's just a big chunk of people coming in. And at the same time, there is economic decline, which is what you mentioned there. House prices are going up, services are in decline because of government cutting costs. Your wages haven't increased by much, especially versus the increase in price of goods. So people are really feeling that pain. And at the same time, there's an easy finger to point at, which is what you're seeing, this change in the number of people coming in. And that those two things are kind of fighting each other. But it's very hard to kind of blame someone when it comes to all these different economic issues versus that person that is very different to me.
Yeah. And, you use the example of house prices, because I think this is the key thing, Adi. This is the sort of the key which unlocks everything else. House prices, it becomes an easy thing to blame the immigrants because, it's basic economics, isn't it? If you bring in all these new people, but the housing stock doesn't go up, everything gets bid up in price. Your landlord can say, well, I can put six Indian immigrants in to one house where I'm renting to you and your family. And I'll get 3 times the rent. So no, thank you. But of course, the other side of this ledger is that, well, okay, so you bring in more residents, but build more houses. That's where the problem lies, because so much of the cost of living in Britain, as in most developed countries, is being driven higher by the cost of land. And the cost of land is being driven higher by the cost of accommodation and the cost of all real estate, not just housing, but businesses. I mean, part of the reason you pay so much for a cup of coffee in London is because the owner of the cafe has to pay so much in rent. You can go to other cities in the world which have managed to expand very rapidly, but keep their housing costs quite reasonable. And you see how much more accessible life becomes, how much everything becomes cheaper as a result of that. When you're hiring workers who themselves have to pay inflated rents, and you have to pay an inflated rent on your shop, the price of everything in the shop goes up, which creates a sort of vicious spiral. Now, why is it that real estate has become so expensive? It is because of this asset owning class, which depends on the standard to which it's grown accustomed for those prices to go up every year. And what's the easiest way to ensure prices go up? You constrict supply. So there are all sorts of provisions in place, and government after government, they have tried. They talk about planning reform in order to increase the supply of housing. None of them have hit it. I mean, funnily enough, I think under Boris Johnson, what was actually Dominic Cummings, who sort of had that idea of doing everything by an algorithm, that was roundly rejected in Parliament. But something that radical might have done the job, but only if you coupled it with a public house building program. And the way Labour's doing it won't work, relying on private developers, because private developers have the same interests. You don't want to have a massive build out of housing because that will cause house prices to fall and their profits to drop. So you need to do the sort of thing that was done after the war, where there was a massive expansion in public house building along with fairly easy planning reform. If prices on real estate came down, it would bring down the cost of everything and would open up all sorts of new possibilities. Who loses out on that? The owners. Who are the owners? It is this relatively privileged group in society, and it is the pension funds themselves. I mean, part of the reason I believe the government, missed a real opportunity during COVID when they sent everyone out remote working and people started moving to Shropshire and North Yorkshire where they could get cheaper accommodation, working for London, and the government tried to force them back into the offices. This was a perfect chance for leveling up, just redistribute some of the best paid people in the country throughout the country, revive those local communities. And instead they tried to force everybody back into the office. But I think that really came down to the fact that the property values of the large investment funds, which were themselves owned by pension funds in commercial real estate, were suffering, and were going to have to write down the value of their assets, which was going to hit existing beneficiaries. And as a political group, that's just one group you don't touch. I think this is the kind of conversation that needs to happen if we're really going to try and take the sting out of this rhetoric about immigration, is to say, look, there are some people who've done very well. And it's time that they have the broadest shoulders. They're the ones that we have to start transferring more of this cost into. And in Britain, inescapably, the day will come, that conversation will have to happen, because the triple lock, for example, will eventually bankrupt Britain. There's just no way it can continue. If you want to say, well, we need to create a more generous pension, say you need to create a more generous pension, this is how we'll pay for it, by raising taxes on the working population. And, be upfront about this. Don't try and pretend that you can somehow magic growth into existence and solve the problem, because all it does is it kicks the can down the road. The problems become more acute. We have this sort of sliding austerity that we're experiencing, where nothing ever seems to get better. And nobody wants to come open, talk what the real problem is. They keep making, magical promises like every party is committed to the triple lock. And it's going to, this is the sort of thing that is fundamentally driving this fight over scarce resources.
Yeah. No one does promises like reform, though. They are another level. Just on the solution of this, because I don't think I got that. How do we increase the house stock? Because, Labor is saying we're going to, change the regulation around this so that we're able to build more, but it doesn't seem to be happening. What is how do we move forward on this?
So planning reform is a necessary but not sufficient step, Adi. I mean, first of all, you take away the power of planning meetings. You take away the power of existing householders to show up at a planning meeting and object to a development on the grounds it'll change the character of the neighborhood. You either centralize it, or you do what the Conservatives tried to do under Boris Johnson, very brief-lived experiment with going with this algorithmic planning, where you sort of basically say, well, this community can take in this many more houses, so the council must build allow this many more houses. Something like that. It sounds like an authoritarian solution. Another way you could do is the Japanese approach, which is just whoever owns a property can do whatever they want. You have a house in it and you want to build an 8-story, whatever is skyrise, provided you can put in the infrastructure to service it, you get to do what you want. You get a rather more chaotic planning process, but you just have to visit Japanese cities to say it can produce very livable cities. But I think the main thing, Adi, is you can't rely, as every government has been trying to do, on private developers. Now, there's a couple of reasons they want to rely on private developers. One is that the development lobby has become very consolidated. They're very powerful. They're big political donors. So they want to keep them happy. I think the other one is it becomes a way of them not having to bite the bullet on, you can't improve public services. If growth is slowing, you can't improve public services if you're not going to raise taxes. Nobody wants to come out and say this, but there's just no way around it. If you leave it to private developers, they're not going to build the houses fast enough, because, as I say, they want to keep the supply coming at a steady pace so that house prices and commercial real estate prices remain relatively elevated. They make more profit that way. So you need a public agency that will hire the builders to actually go and build these houses. You put those into the rental economy. They don't have to be social housing as such. Council estates. My grandmother lived in a council estate, and it was a lovely, looked like any middle class estate. Those were the kind of people who were living in council estates. It wasn't just meant for the poorest in society. And you want to create, and in the process of doing that, though, you increase the supply sufficiently that across the board rents come down. That will definitely knock the value of investments held by a number of the big institutional investors. And that's going to be a tough decision. It's a very radical decision. But if someone doesn't make it, we're just going to have a kind of the continued chaotic slide into a solution, which is what we're facing with right now.
Got it. Okay. So have the government step in and actually start building instead of relying on private companies.
Yeah. And that would mean they'd either have to raise taxes, or they'd have to make a case to the bond markets that they've got a viable strategy for generating the income necessary to pay the debts in building this stock of housing. The British government's in a bit of a bad way because of the fact that it's managed to get itself into a real bind in its borrowing. I mean, there was an awful lot of careless borrowing that happened during the pandemic. But I think on the other hand, the bond markets have shown that if you separate spending from investment, and you actually, the government has a viable plan, so they're building houses that they will then rent out and use that income to cover the cost of the construction. I don't think you'd necessarily have a Liz Truss moment. They have to be prepared to do that.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned before we need to start taxing the wealthy class. So do you support, there's this whole debate now about wealth taxes. Do you support a wealth tax? And if so, wouldn't that push a lot of that class to leave?
I think actually, I mean, symbolically, there be an argument for a wealth tax, but it's not how you're going to solve the fiscal problem. I think what Britain has got to do, it has to face up to the fact that everyone is going to, almost everyone, not those at the lowest ends of the income scale, but most, if you want the NHS to be what it has always been and to stay that way, if you want decent schools, if you want safer streets, if you want cleaner streets, we have to pay for it. We can't keep just taxing a small segment of society and think because there is, and especially that segment of society which has the most capacity to find ways to avoid the tax, to move their money abroad, to hire very good accountants. And I think, I would recommend looking at this sort of the Scandinavian model, at the Danish model, where they have an excellent set of public services, but everybody pays their share of tax, and it's mainly through consumption tax. But it's something people are willing to do because the quality of service is so high. Part of the difficulty in Britain is we keep ratcheting up taxes slowly through stealth, little bits here, little bits there, and the tax rate just keeps going up. And nobody sees an improvement of services. I think what we need to say is it's like, do you want to upgrade from eating at McDonald's every week and start eating at Honest Burger or wherever it is you want? Because you're quite prepared to pay a higher price in a restaurant if you're going to get better food and services. Why now not apply that logic to the government, to the services we get from the state? Pay more, but get more.
Yeah, I think it goes back to trust. Do I trust?
There is an element, yeah.
Do I trust that the government's going to use this money in an efficient way to reinvest in the right in infrastructure? And from the past couple of years, people just don't trust the government because, a lot of people say, I don't mind paying a bit more if I'm getting something of good quality. But we're seeing, as you mentioned, services go down. Everything's kind of feels like it's crumbling. At the same time, it feels like taxes is at an all-time high. The thresholds of the brackets of what your tax is not changing. So that's kind of like a stealth tax, inheritance tax. They've changed the tax on pensions now, council tax, car tax. Every angle is taxes. And then you've got countries like Dubai, 0% tax. It's very attractive, especially for those that are earning the high income, which is actually the people that are paying the taxes. So that's I think a lot of that level are thinking, do I move now, especially if this autumn we're going to see an increase even further of taxes?
Could be, but I think there's another side to this, Addy. I think part of the difficulty is that as you know, I mean, yes, taxes keep getting ratcheted up. It's kind of the frog in boiling water scenario. We keep sort of, increasing the temperature a bit, but we're not seeing anything in return because fundamentally the taxes are going up just to plug a fiscal gap that the government keeps. Every government is hoping, that they will somehow, growth will come back and save them from all this rather than confronting it, which is, really a big part of the argument in our book is you're not going to be able to restore the growth rates of old and Western countries. Stop trying to pretend you can. The circumstances which gave rise to those extraordinary post-war growth rates were time limited. They were unique. They were not going to be repeated. So now we have to engage in a conversation. This is what we have. What are we going to do with it? Not what will I somehow concoct out of thin air. And yes, you're absolutely right. Reform is the worst at making those promises. I think the solution to reform is to have it, let it have a majority government for a few years. It'll collapse. And, you will have a sort of a major fiscal crisis probably within the first year, I think, or all its promises broken. But nevertheless, I think that, we're in a situation where the trust is eroding for that reason, because politicians keep saying they will do something they can't do. And I think what they need to do is be more honest with the public and say, look, we can't restore that growth rate. What we do have is a growth rate which enables us to generate added resources every year. And we can begin having a conversation about what we're going to do with those resources. But in the meantime, if we need to repair things now, we have to bear the cost now. We need to figure out how to do that. And maybe the conversation needs to be initiated outside of politics. Politicians aren't trusted to do it and never will be trusted to do it. But it is a conversation that needs to be had. And I think certainly journalists have a part to play in this by holding politicians' feet to the fire. And every time they make these promises, just saying, okay, how are you going to pay for this? And, and I think journalists have been doing that Rachel Reeves made a number of promises during the election campaign last year she never should have made. And they keep reminding her of this. She keeps saying she's going to keep these promises. Well, she won't. Might be able to get those promises because it was irresponsible of her to do it then. Either she breaks her promises and faces reality, or she'll need to be replaced. And I think that is eroding trust in government, is that it's taking too long to have that necessary reckoning with reality.
Yeah. And I feel it's pushing a lot of people to say, they look at reform, which some of the things they say is, it's common sense stuff. Whether we can pay for it is a different story. But they're saying, what could go wrong? Things are already terrible. Let's try this thing and see how it goes. Yeah. But I think within a year, there's going to be big cracks showing up. Do you feel like democracy is failing in the West, or at least that's kind of making people think that democracy is failing, and it's pushing people more towards accepting a bit more autocracy? I mean, we're seeing that with Trump a bit. He's doing things when it comes to the courts, to kind of the individual liberty, and people are kind of accepting it because they're saying it's better than what we had before. Do you feel that democracy is failing in the West?
It is certainly going through a moment of crisis. I would not say, I think people are starting to raise that question. Is it failing? I wouldn't, and it's certainly being compromised. The course of Trump's presidency will be a real test case for that. There's a division of opinion between the pessimists and the optimists in America, between those who think he is undermining all the foundations of American democracy and it will never survive, and those who say actually he's encountering pushback. That a lot of his increasing anger and his increasingly radical steps represent his frustration that he isn't actually able to get things done. He's sort of using the Justice Department to go after his personal enemies. But if all of these cases end up being thrown out of court and the people he was maliciously prosecuting sue the government and leave the taxpayer with a bill for Trump's malfeasance, that people will turn on him. And in truth, if you look at his approval ratings, they keep declining. He's not actually, I keep hearing people say, he's getting away with it. Well, I don't know how we would assess him getting away with it. His popularity is declining. He's not winning votes with this. And it may well be that he is ultimately undermining himself as a result of this. That's difficult to say. I think in other countries, I would say democracy has been proving quite resilient. I think it is proving resilient. I'm not yet ready to sort of declare time on democracy in Britain. I think reform is deeply irresponsible, but I think the closer we get to an election is only 4 years away. People can say, yeah, I'll vote for reform, but when the day comes, what are they actually going to tick that ballot? Because reform will come in from far more scrutiny. It's received far too little scrutiny and far too much airtime, I think. There needs to be much more detailed scrutiny about what it's trying to do. And I think that's coming too. I think the other mistake that reform is making is, I think Nigel Farage is so smitten by Donald Trump. They're starting to mimic some of the things that are well tested in the British public. And for example, anti-vaxxing and, talking about, whether or not paracetamol is bad for women and pregnant. This is just not going to win votes in Britain. And I think I wouldn't rule out the survival of British democracy. But I do think we need better leadership. I think we need more courageous leadership. I want to come back to something in that vein. You said, Adi, about the problem with taxing the wealthy is where they can just pack up and go to Dubai, which is, and not just Dubai, several of the Gulf states offer very attractive tax regimes. But on the other hand, I know Dubai, and I know London, and 6 of one, half dozen the other. If I was given the choice, I'd much rather live in London, and I think most anybody would say that. I mean, if you're pushed to Dubai by a tax regime, I don't think it's just a tax regime. I think it's because the attractions, perhaps, of London you see perhaps waning. I mean, there are a number of things that have to do with the decline of the public sector. One of which is crime. That your house is broken into, and the police will say, well, you will file a report for your insurance purposes, but we're not going to investigate this. We just don't have the resources. So this is an example. I think if people everywhere, and I think not just the wealthy, as I say, I think if every one of us were prepared to pay a bit more in VAT, for example, in order to generate the resources we need to really tackle these issues and restore fairness to this system, it would. But I think the bigger thing is that taxes on income would become a lot more affordable if we're not having to pay as much as rent. And I think this is a big part of what the cost of living is, because we are supporting a small but relatively privileged share of the population and the standard to which they've grown accustomed. And the way to do it isn't to go after them with taxes. It's to bring down their asset value so that the rest of our cost of living goes down. I'd be quite happy to pay more than that if I was paying half the rent I pay in London, that sort of thing. And I think that would go for most people. Yes, Dubai has its charms, and, it has a lot more sunshine than London, but, it doesn't have the same theater. It doesn't have the same street life at all. The kind of things that you and I love about life in London. I mean, yes, it's a very cosmopolitan place, but it's a different kind of cosmopolitan. It isn't the same, in my opinion. I don't know, maybe you disagree, but it's not the same kind of vibrant cosmopolitanism you get in London streets. I used to, as a writer, I often would, if I was having writer's block, I would just sort of walk down leave the apartment, leave the flat, and catch a bus. You sit on the upstairs of one of the buses, go through London, and just observe life in the streets. It's so stimulating.
It's it is great. It's like almost like a festival happening every day.
Exactly. And it's free. That part of it is free. It costs nothing.
For sure.
You have to pay an awful lot for culture in other places. In London, you just get it,
Yeah.
The things you see in particular in a neighborhood like Brixton on a daily basis, it's very animating.
It is quite unique. What lessons from history, Rome or otherwise, do you think are most urgent for Western policymakers to absorb today?
Well, I think lesson number one from the history of the fall of the Roman Empire was that there was an element of choice. There is an element of hubris involved. That what really bankrupted the Roman Empire was this determination to go to war with its Persian rival, and it was a war it didn't need. It was a war of choice. And that so weakened it on its northern frontiers that the barbarian invasions, were able to then overrun the defenses and begin carving up the empire. And I think in the book, we draw the parallels with how do you engage with what is the rising, or what are the rising sort of, not empires necessarily, but growth poles in the world economy that are a challenge to the West. And in the first instance, it's China. And how do you engage with China? And we make an argument for much less confrontational, not necessarily, that there are going to be tensions with China because there are some existential differences between the systems, but that regarding it as being an enemy that has to be put back in its place, we think is just, it's a path that is going to lead to the more rapid decline, we think, of the West. So I think that is a key lesson. A second lesson not to take, which is the most popular one on the right, is the barbarian invasions. There's there's no parallel between the barbarian invasions of antiquity and what Boris Johnson called uncontrolled migration today. I mean, uncontrolled migration, small boats coming into Britain is such a small share of total population movement. It is infinitesimal. It is small. There's nothing comparable to what happened in antiquity. Immigration flows are controlled by the recipient country. The fact that immigrant numbers shot up in Britain in the last few years was a policy decision taken by the government, and it alone should take responsibility and stop blaming it on these sort of hordes who are coming over the borders. It's just a rhetoric which is a way for politicians to evade responsibility for their own decisions. but just makes the situation worse. There is nothing, as I say, comparable there. Migration today is highly controlled. I mean, there were no passports in antiquity. There were no border controls. There were nothing similar at all. And the immigrants who come into Western countries on net are actually contributing to the gross domestic product of those countries and to making the system sustainable. That was not the case in antiquity. The barbarians who came in were actually eroding the empire's tax base. So there's a fundamental difference there. And I think the third one is, as we say, the modern period is very different from antiquity because technological progress means that we can continue to grow the economy. And it's astonishing when you think about it that we're having a conversation about who's to blame for decline when in fact the economy as on paper is growing every year. The problem is that we haven't changed the distribution regime, which ensured benefits to this top share of the population. So if you think if everybody was rising at 4% before, but now that's gone down to 1%, one group does this, which requires the other group to go down even lower. That's the problem, that we're squeezing more and more out of the working population. And in order to support the non-working population, a good segment of whom are in fact retired, and we're squeezing it both through the tax and spending regime, but also through, as I say, largely through the property values themselves, which have been inflated by central bank policy. And I think that's one of the ways that working people are being squeezed so hard. I think if we tackle the distributional questions, we'll see that a lot of the other issues no longer exist. That is a big, bold step. It's an internal change. It's not one we're going to get by making America or Britain great again. It will be by looking at the resources we have already and using those to everyone's best advantage.
So it's a focus on kind of changing how we tax people and how we distribute the benefits.
Yeah, and I think it also involves, as I say, central banks, ending the policy of currency debasement, essentially, which is what we've been doing. If you look at the value of the stock market as expressed in gold, if we'd never left the gold standard, we would have been a stationary economy for the last 50 years. That's the reality. Is essentially we're growing very slowly, but we're still trying to distribute these benefits to a share of the population that we can't afford anymore. And we do that by squeezing the working population. That comes down hard on young people. They're the ones who are showing the most strong turn against democracy because, quite understandably, they're saying this system isn't working. We want to win their trust again. We have to make the system work for everybody.
100%. John, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. If people wanted to reach out to you or find your book, where can they do that?
Well, the book is easy enough to find. It's on on all the distribution services. Your bookstore, if it doesn't have it, will order it for you. It's on Amazon. So, and there are different editions depending on what country you're in. But I'm very reachable. I write regularly for a British publication called Unheard. I'm a regular contributor to them, so people can always read me there and reach out to me. I can't say I'm the best email correspondent, but I do get around to it in due course.
John, thank you so much for today.
It's been a pleasure. How do you have a lovely day?
You too.